Over the last few videos, we've been talking about rockstar Rob Zombie's Firefly trilogy, 3 distinctive pulp grindhouse exploitation satanic panic splatter flicks that follow the sadistic, nihilistic, amoral escapades of a family of psychopaths who exist purely to cause pain and destruction. We've specifically covered how the first 2 films played off their idiosyncratic differences to journey us from the eccentric carnival funhouse theatricality of the Firefly family's personal domain to the much more grounded and gritty survivalism of forcing them into our world when theirs is deservingly stripped away from them. I highly recommend you watch those 2 videos for the full context, because going into the third and final film, 3 from Hell, does require some essence of knowledge to understand how we got to where we are. That said, as a very brief summary for those who won't go back and watch them, the Firefly family is basically a Manson-esque play on the Sawyer family from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where decades of mass so-called violence, torture, and depravity eventually caught up with them when a Waco-style police raid sees only 3 of them escape. While attempting to make it to the Mexican border to start fresh, the 3 fugitives, Otis, Baby, and Captain Spalding, collectively known as the Devil's Rejects, find themselves hunted by a vengeful fanatic called Sheriff Wydell, whose brother was a victim to the family. However, after managing to dispatch him at the cost of what's left of their family and home, they are soon ceremoniously gunned down in a final stand against police before they can make it to Mexico. So why then is there a third movie? In theory, 3 from Hell should not exist. It feels like a fan film that came out 10 years too late and is very haphazardly stitched together with the faint idea of where the trio might end up if we retcon the beautifully pitch-perfect ending to The Devil's Rejects. This is fundamentally the film's main cardinal sin before it even begins. The Devil's Rejects had such an appropriately brutal yet bittersweet conclusion that sees these reprehensible characters finally get their just desserts for all the wickedness they have committed, whilst also letting them go out on their own terms. I strongly stressed it throughout the last 2 videos that the distinct feature of this trilogy is that it completely rejects morality and reframes who in any other story would objectively be the villains as protagonists undergoing their own twisted hero's journey. The thing about the ending to The Devil's Rejects is that it acknowledges the trio as rightfully deserving of punishment without undermining their hero status akin to Bonnie and Clyde. It gives us this subversive sense of justice where, thank God, their reign of terror finally comes to an end, but boy did they go out in fucking style. Sure, you don't technically see them die, so the door was always open for a sequel, but it's more so frustrating that Rob Zombie would undermine the sentiment, especially when 3 from Hell then tries to frame the rejects as martyrs who were fighting against the oppression of the man. I mean, I guess I kinda see what it's going for as a slight countercultural reflection on how Charles Manson attracted young people who felt marginalized and disillusioned, but rather than make a compelling point about the power of violent rebellion and infamy indirectly perpetuated by a state of systematic oppression, it sorta just fetishizes the rejects to give them an air of justification for their ways that's contradicted by the fact that all they ever did was murder innocent people. Taking place 10 years after The Devil's Rejects, 3 from Hell opens with our trio being convicted and segregated in prison for their unholy crimes, with the catalyst of their eventual breakout being Captain Spalding's execution on death row. This here is the most significant elephant in the room because, tragically at the time of production, Sid Haig was undergoing major health issues, resulting in his iconic character being written out of the film and replaced with a new character played by Richard Brake, who, in fairness, was a fitting substitute to carry the torch in his own creepy Richard Brakey way, but more on that later. Sid Haig sadly passed away 5 days after the film released, and there is no doubt his presence is sorely missing. But to be as sensitive as I can, writing out his character actually ends up being one of the few positives I can give the film, so let me explain. The story this time is essentially broken into two parts. The first part sees Otis break out of prison with the help of his estranged half-brother Foxy, also labelled the Midnight Wolfman, but not before Otis kills Danny Trejo, who you might recall as one of the vigilante bounty hunters hired by Sheriff Wydell in The Devil's Rejects. Bank this information because it will become relevant shortly, but from here, Otis and Foxy plot to break Baby out of her prison by taking the prison warden's family hostage and forcing him to assist, eventually allowing the trio to finally escape to Mexico. The second half basically sees the trio, and by extension most likely the entire production team as if it were an Adam Sandler joint, having a great big mighty piss-up celebrating Day of the Dead, until Danny Trejo's character's mobster dad Aquarius learns of their presence and sends his men to assassinate them, resulting in a massively underwhelming shootout. The point I wanted to make out of all that carnage is that the Day of the Dead aspect is actually one of the few, if not only times in the trilogy, where it shows a surprisingly human and introspective side. As a renowned celebration in remembrance for loved ones who have passed, Day of the Dead gives the characters a chance to reflect on the Firefly family and Captain Spalding, while also honouring Sid Haig's fierce commitment to making Spalding the iconic horror character that he is. Look, while I don't think the film is the most emotionally thoughtful, it's still as problematic as the other two. Haig was a tremendous and beloved presence in the horror scene, and the sequence effectively breaks from tradition to devote time to human sincerity that honours the love and friendship this cast and crew shared with each other for over 25 years. I will say this, for all the shit I'll give this movie, for it to pay respects to its cult status, fandom, and all those who helped bring this trilogy to life, it does make me go back on what I said about this movie not needing to exist, because my personal feelings aside, I can understand the value others will get out of this as a legitimate form of closure to some degree. Anyway, the first half of the film is your regularly scheduled programming, as Otis spews vapid nihilism and satanic babble in a bid to recapture his enigmatic monologuing from The Devil's Rejects, but the difference here is that it just feels way too forced and lacks the intense sense of indifference that made his character so fearful. The way I see it, 3 from Hell is a regression from the maturity of The Devil's Rejects, as it starts to lean back into the campiness of House of a Thousand Corpses, but with the significantly smaller budget and seemingly lesser artistic prowess, it just doesn't bite as hard, especially when it starts to rely on CG blood that just waters down the brutality. It's interesting to me because his previous film, 31, was fairly solid in my opinion, but 3 from Hell has this strange paradox of being too edgelordy tryhard while being somewhat tired and non-committal to its tone. This is perhaps most evident in its 2 distinct antagonists. In the first half, we're dealing with Warden Virgil Dallas Harper, who is essentially by design a poor-man Sheriff Wydell, as he likes to assert his authority over his prison, but in reality is nothing more than a sleazy coked-up poser reeking of infidelity. Out of all the new characters, I would argue he has the most stylistic depth, you could say. I actually liked how unthreatening he ultimately was, because he's shown to have a genuinely idyllic life outside the confines of the dark, dingy, depraved world that's been established thus far, only for Otis and Foxy to enter his world and infect it with the inevitable corruption that Dallas is already trying to hide from his wife. If you're new to my channel, welcome! This is going to sound preposterous. However, there is potentially something to the idea that Dallas's own sinfulness has figuratively and literally finally followed him home, and innocent people are now going to suffer as a result of Otis and Foxy forcing Dallas to break Baby out of prison almost as a perverse punishment for his sins, to which the newly reformed Devil's Rejects then unsurprisingly murder everyone. With their slate clean, the second half introduces the polar opposite antagonist in the form of Aquarius, who, in my eyes, is a massive missed opportunity when it comes to matching the depravity of the trio. It made me wish Warden Dallas was the sole antagonist, because there's at least a little more meat on the bone with how his amoral character is framed as running his his prison like a death factory in the words of Otis, and then contrasting it against the pleasant home life he takes for granted. Aquarius, on the other hand, is just a one-note bad guy taken from the bottom of Robert Rodriguez's Mexico trilogy, which, come to think of it, is exactly what the last act of the film is trying to be, but without the flavorful spicy wit. In fact, the word that kept coming to mind for me in the second half was exhausted, and it is actually something reflected upon by Otis, who half admits at one point to feeling too old from a decade of incarceration that he now just wants peace more than anything else. Morally, I'm still of the opinion these fuckers have to die, but I did appreciate the thin sentiment of them growing out of their wickedness after finishing things off in the first half, but really, there's just not enough nuance to go down that path. At first, it seemed to me that Foxy was the one to bring a newfound calmness to the group to reflect their aging, but he ends up being too indistinct to add to the dynamic, resulting in him feeling like a placeholder with Spalding now out of the picture. You can definitely see how Spalding's sickness and aging did originally play into the narrative, because when you couple this with Baby's significantly increased mania that makes her dependent on Otis and Foxy, it touches on the trio withering away and losing their drive, which in turn I hoped would result in a revised ending that echoed back to the Devil's Rejects, where they've now lived long enough to become the villains, so to speak, bringing their inverted hero's journey full circle. When Aquarius and his men finally arrive for vengeance, there's something so fittingly incidental about the big bad ultimately being just a footnote in one of Otis's earlier killings. Rather than it be the system that takes them down, it's something of borderline irrelevance. They just finally pissed off an even greater force than them, at least at first. I find myself thinking back to Tiny's death in The Devil's Rejects, where he willingly chooses death to be with his family, while the others choose freedom. But it's long established since the start that this world does not reward freedom or victory. If anything, it only delays the inevitable, as death is the only out. Yet, rather than execute on this overarching theme, the film simply ends with the trio surviving the shootout and immolating Aquarius as they triumphantly walk away, which ironically is a far greater whimper than the bang it wishes to be. Why? But to be as sensitive as that. Oh my god. Ryan, slow down. Oh, that's good. Did I press the fucking button? Oh shit, I nailed that without even looking at the script. Fucking yeah.